On the Eastern Front, German soldiers learned to fear a sound that wasn't there, or rather, the absence of one. Late at night, in the dark over their lines, they would hear a faint whoosh, like wind over a broom. And then their world would explode. By the time they looked up, the bombs were already falling. The Germans called them the Nachthexen, the night witches. They believed only witches could fly so silently in the dark. They were not witches. They were young women, some still teenagers, flying obsolete wooden biplanes with no guns, no radios, and no parachutes. And they would fly more combat missions and terrify a more powerful enemy than almost anyone thought possible. This is the story of the Night Witches. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion in human history, smashing into the Soviet Union along a 1,000-mile front. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities burned, millions were killed or captured in a matter of months. The Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival, and it needed every soldier, every pilot, every aircraft it could find. Across the country, women volunteered by the thousands, to dig, to nurse, to build. But many wanted to fight, and they were turned away. The army did not want women in combat. It would take one extraordinary woman to change that. Her name was Marina Ruskova. Before the war, she was the most famous woman pilot in the Soviet Union, a record-breaking navigator and a national hero. Thousands of women wrote to her, begging for a chance to fly and fight. Ruskova took their letters directly to the top, to Joseph Stalin himself. In October 1941, with German troops closing on Moscow, Stalin gave his approval. Ruskova would form 3 all-female air regiments: pilots, navigators, mechanics, armourers. Women would do every job. One of those regiments would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The world had never seen anything like it. A combat unit flown, navigated, armed, and commanded entirely by women. They came from universities, factories, and farms. Many were barely out of school. They had months to learn what normally took years. The aircraft they were given was almost an insult. The Polikarpov PO-2 was a small biplane built in the 1920s, a basic trainer made of plywood and canvas. It was painfully slow, slower than many cars. It had an open cockpit exposed to the freezing wind. It carried no guns, no armor, and no radio. It could carry only 2 bombs at a time, slung beneath its lower wings. On paper, it was hopelessly obsolete. But the women and their commanders saw what the PO-2 could secretly do. It was almost silent at low throttle. It could fly slower than a fighter could safely chase. And it could land and take off from a rough field in the dark. A weakness turned into a weapon. The most outdated plane on the front was about to become the most haunting. The conditions they flew in were brutal. The open cockpit meant temperatures far below freezing. The wind burned their faces and froze their hands on the controls. For much of the war, they flew without parachutes, partly to save weight, allowing one more bomb. If their plane was hit, there was often no way out. The PO-2 was made of wood and fabric. A single tracer round could turn it into a flying torch. And they faced something else: contempt. Many male officers dismissed them, refused to take them seriously, and expected them to fail within weeks. The Night Witches answered that contempt the only way they could. They flew, again and again and again. Their signature tactic was as elegant as it was terrifying. They flew at night, in the dark, with no lights. As they neared the target, they would cut their engines and glide. Silent, invisible. The only sound was the wind sighing over the wings. That whisper of wind was the sound the Germans came to dread. The sound, they said, was a witch's broomstick. At the last moment, they released their bombs onto the sleeping enemy below. Supply dumps, encampments, rear positions, then restarted the engine and slipped away into the night. They flew so low and so slow that the fast German fighters struggled to catch them without stalling. The witches turned their plane's greatest weakness, its speed, into their best defense. Because the PO2 carried only 2 bombs, a single run was never enough. So they flew again and again. They would land, while the ground crews, also women, rearmed the plane in minutes by hand in the cold and dark. Then back into the air. On a busy night, a single crew might fly 8, 10, even 18 sorties before dawn. Sortie after sortie, they robbed the enemy of sleep, of supplies, and of peace. The constant harassment wore the Germans down, night after night, for years. Across the war, the regiment would fly an astonishing number of missions, more than 30,000 sorties in all. To the German soldiers on the receiving end, the attacks felt supernatural. An enemy you could not hear, could not see, that struck from a clear night sky. They gave the women the name that would follow them into history: Nachthexen, night witches. The fear was so real that, according to legend, any German pilot who managed to shoot one down was rewarded with an Iron Cross. Think about that. A first-line air force with the best fighters in the world offering a medal for downing a plywood trainer flown by a 20-year-old woman. That was the measure of how much they had come to be feared. But fear cuts both ways, and the witches paid a terrible price for the terror they spread. Flak batteries and searchlights waited for them. Caught in a beam of light, a slow wooden biplane became an easy target. And because they carried no parachutes for so long, a hit often meant the end. They watched friends fall in flames and flew again the next night anyway. Over the course of the war, the regiment lost 32 of its women. Each loss was a sister, a roommate, a friend. They mourned in the morning. And when night fell, they climbed back into their cockpits. Some of them became legends. Nadezhda Popova flew hundreds of missions. On one single night, she is said to have flown 18. She was shot down more than once, walked away, and returned to the air each time. She said she never understood how she survived when so many did not. Their commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, led the regiment through the entire war, the only woman ever to command a combat aviation regiment and to be decorated for it. They flew over the Caucasus, Crimea, Belarus, Poland, and finally toward Germany itself, following the front all the way to the end. More than 20 of these women would be named Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor for valor. Some nights nearly broke them. Over heavily defended targets, the Germans ringed the sky with searchlights and guns, daring the witches to come. On the worst of those nights, they devised desperate tricks, flying in groups so that some drew the searchlights and the guns while another slipped through the darkness to strike. It meant some crews deliberately made themselves the target so their sisters could live and the bombs could fall. It was an act of breathtaking courage, repeated night after night. They lost aircraft, they lost friends, but the bombs kept finding their mark. By the spring of 1945, the witches had chased the German army all the way back across Europe. They flew their last missions in the final days of the war, having never stopped, having never broken. In all, they had flown more than 30,000 combat sorties and dropped thousands of tons of bombs in plywood planes that the world had written off as junk. They were, by any measure, one of the most decorated and feared units of the entire war. And then, like so many women who fought, they were quietly sent home. The all-female regiment was disbanded months after victory. Many were not even allowed to fly in the celebration parade. For years their story faded into the margins of history, but it never disappeared. Slowly, the legend of the night witches was remembered, and honoured. The night witches proved something their own army had refused to believe, that courage has no gender, and that the right idea can turn the most hopeless tool into a weapon of legend. They flew junk planes with no guns and no parachutes against the most powerful military on Earth, and they made that military afraid of the dark. 30,000 missions, 32 lives, and a name the enemy gave them in fear that they wore with pride: the Night Witches. If you want more of the forgotten weapons and impossible courage that shaped history's wars, subscribe. The bravest stories are often the ones we were never told.